Hi, it's Stephen.
And Tilda from the Ori Mill.
From the Ori Mill. And today is something a bit different. We're going to talk about a technique called
the Italian bind off.
And if you want to jump straight to just the technique itself, then the timestamp is in the comments and you can jump straight there. But if you want to stick around and talk about it, then please do. Tell me, what is the Italian bind off?
Italian bind off is a lovely rounded bind off that is used by Petite Knit of many designers. Many designers,
but Petite Knit are commonly using the Italian bind off.
Yeah, at the bottom of the garment.
So show me, you've got a garment here, this little nice jumper.
Yeah.
And it's rounded
No,
edge.
It's not that one.
Not that one.
It's the side one. This is some double knitting. You can see it's a nice rounded edge. If you put the...
Let's go overhead.
Yeah. So here you can see that. And you can see it's a nice kind of rounded. It's almost like the stitches just continues round. So it's done by using grafting or the Kitchener stitch. So it's done in a slightly different way to how you would finish it off. You're using the Kitchener stitch in socks for the toe, but you're doing it differently when you're having all your stitches sitting on like circular needles in the round.
So just quickly tell us about the Kitchener stitch.
Well, the Kitchener stitch is really, or grafting, is a way of sewing your knitting together. Or in this case, we're actually sewing almost like the front and the back of the bottom of the garment together. So we are basically making duplicate stitches.
Okay.
So it makes it look like, your knitting just goes round.
And the Kitchener stitch came from World War I, where
Yes.
Lord Kitchener invented it to make it more comfortable for soldiers.
I think it might have been around for longer, but so that's why it's also called grafting. But
Right.
Lord Kitchener definitely started using it in socks.
To make soldiers' feet more comfortable in boots,
Yeah.
so there wasn't a seam.
Yeah, so there wasn't a seam because one of the problems during the war was that seam that normally was in the toe of a sock actually gave the soldiers trench foot.
Wow, why? Because it held on to
because it was
bacteria
rubbing,
and stuff, or rubbing.
It was rubbing against the toes, creating. They were on their feet all the time, so it was rubbing against their toes and was basically causing like wounds. So
amazing. So this scarf you've knitted a while ago has this really kind of funky edge on it.
Yeah, and that's the wrong side usually.
It's the wrong side, sorry. And
that's a Pico cast off.
Pico.
Yeah, I would believe so.
Where does that come from?
So that is one of the Rowan ones in a Rowan magazine, and I actually can't remember. I think it's called the Bee Scarf, but it's only available in the magazine.
Cool. So there's different types of bind off, which we would be covering as we go. But let's jump into the Italian bind off.
Yeah. Italian cast off or bind off. So when you're doing the Italian cast off or bind off, you have 2 steps you need to do. So the first step is to do 2 setup rows of double knitting. Sometimes those rows are included in the pattern, but it's not always the case. So you need to be aware that you do need to do either 2 or 4 rows of double knitting before you can actually do the actual cast off with the darning needle. The reason you're doing those setup rows are so you can separate the knit stitches from the purl stitches slightly. So when you're doing the bind off with the needle, it looks like the stitches are knitted in kind of in a continuous stretch from the front to the back. That gives that rounded edge. So the first double knitting setup round goes like this. You knit the knit stitch, then slip the purl stitch purlwise with yarn in front. Knit the knit stitch, slip the purl stitch purlwise with yarn in front. If you're a UK knitter, this is how it looks like. So knit the stitch, bring your yarn forward, then slip your purl stitch purlwise and bring your yarn back to the back. Knit the next stitch, put your yarn forward, slip the next stitch purlwise with your yarn in front and bring your yarn to the back. And a continental knitter, it's knit your stitch. You can actually use your finger to put your yarn forward while you slip the purl stitch purlwise, bring your yarn back and knit, or you can do it this way where you just put your needle behind the yarn into this purl stitch purlwise and just bring your yarn forward like this. That's how I normally would do it. But yeah, feel free to do it whatever way feels most natural to you. The main thing is that you slip your purl stitches with the yarn in front of the purl stitch. And this is how you continue the full round. So here we are at the end of the first setup round, where we knit the last knit stitch and slip the last purl stitch with the yarn in front. Slip your marker, and now we're ready to do the second double knitting setup round. We slipped the purl stitches in the previous round, so now we want to slip the knit stitches. But instead of having the yarn forward, we want to have the yarn at the back when we slip the knit stitches. So we slip the first knit stitch purlwise with the yarn at the back, and then we purl the purl stitch. So slip the knit stitch with yarn at the back and purl the purl stitch. If you're a UK knitter or using the throwing method, then what you do is you slip the knit stitch purlwise, bring your yarn forward, and then do your purl stitch. For the UK knitter, this is how it's going to look. You slip your knit stitch purlwise, then bring your yarn forward and purl your purl stitch. Bring your yarn back and slip your knit stitch purlwise, bring your yarn forward and do your purl stitch. The continental knitter have the yarn at the back, and you slip your knit stitch purlwise and you purl the purl stitch like this, and slip your knit stitch purlwise and purl your purl stitch. You keep doing this for the full round. So when you've done the two setup rounds, you can do the actual Italian cast off with the darning needle. You need to measure out the tail end to use for the cast off. It needs to be at least 3 times the length of the fabric you're casting off. I often take 4 or even 5 times. You do not want to run out of yarn when you're doing the cast off. It's not looking very good if you have to join in the yarn. So what you can do here is you take your marker off, and there is a 2-step setup before you get into the 4-step repeat. So here you got your knit stitch as the first stitch. You go in purlwise into the knit stitch and basically just pull your yarn through. If this was a purl stitch, you will go knitwise into that stitch and pull the yarn through. So yeah, it can get a little bit tangled up here. So when you've done the knit stitch, you want to get into the purl stitch, and you want to get in knitwise. It's a little bit tricky to get in there, but first what you want to do is you want to pop your needle in from the back to the front in between the 2 first stitches, and you can pull your yarn through. And then you have access to get in knitwise into the purl stitch. You can see here. And then you want to pull your yarn through. So now you're ready for the 4-step Italian cast off or bind off. Go into your knit stitch knitwise and take it off. Now go into the second knit stitch, so you skip a stitch and then you go into that knit stitch purlwise and you draw your yarn through that was step 1 and 2. Step 3 and 4 is you go into your purl stitch purlwise. I'm using a blunt needle so I don't get to catch the wool as easily as if I was using a sharp needle. So purlwise into the purl stitch, and then I want to go knitwise into the knit stitch. I can put my needle in through between the first stitch and the second stitch and then scoop it out as if I'm knitting it. You can see it goes like this, and then I can draw this through. So that's step 3 and 4. I'm going to show you a different way of doing step 3 and 4 in a minute. And again, when you're pulling your yarn up, you need to have it lying kind of snug around the stitch. That's the first stitch on your needle. Don't pull it too tight, that will make the edge look really uneven, and yeah, it just won't look very nice. You're trying to create a stitch so it goes round, so you do not tighten it up. So again, step 1, you go in knitwise through your knit stitch at the edge and pull that off, and then you go purlwise into the second stitch, which is your knit stitch, and you just pull this through. So that's step 1 and 2 are really easy to do in one go. I'm going to show you how to do step 3 and 4 in 2, or even almost 3 steps. So this is step 3. You take your needle, go in purlwise into a purl stitch and take it off. At this point you can pull your yarn through that stitch. Now you can take your needle and bring it in between the first and the second stitch and basically just pull the yarn through all the way to the front. And then you can go into that second purl stitch here knitwise and pull the yarn all the way to the back again. So that is how you do the Italian cast off or bind off. So now we've got the last 4 stitches. We just do what we've done before, so knit into the knit stitch and off, and purl into the next knit stitch and draw your yarn through, and again purl into the purl stitch and off, and then in and go in knitwise into the purl stitch. And now we have the last 2 stitches, so we just do knit off and purl off and draw the yarn through, and you can now see that there's a wee gap here.
Oh yeah.
And you will just close that up by going through over on the other side, over under 2 legs, and then that's kind of closing it up.
Do you have to tie it, or you come back on it?
And then you'll go back in here and weave your stitch in at the back. So
keep it in short.
So there you go. And you can now see this edge here is a nice and rounded edge, and it's very stretchy.
Wait, hold on, I'm out of focus.
So yeah, you can see the nice and rounded edge, and you can see the stretchiness here. You can actually compare. This is a cast on edge I didn't do an Italian cast on, but
this is a cast off edge. No, that's where you cast on.
Yeah, this is a cast on. This is a cast off.
And obviously, a nice finer yarn would get finer and finer.
Yeah, you can see this. I was doing it in chunky because I thought it would be a good idea to show. It's better to show it in chunky. Whereas if you have, this is a double knit here, and you can see the edge is obviously much
finer.
Much finer.
Very nice.
So it's a nice and rounded cast off edge.
Okay, thank you, Tilda, for showing us the Italian bind off.
Yep.
Not a form of torture from Day of the Jackal, but rather a very nice way of finishing off sleeves and bottom of jumpers.
Yeah.
And you can only do it in the round.
No, you can do it back and forth.
You can do it back and forth, okay? And you would just swap into back and forth. You just chose to, but it's most commonly in the round.
Well, the lady that we had, I think we had a question from, I think that was in the round. But yeah, there's a slight difference to if it was flat, like just knitted back and forth, because what you'll do is the first round I showed you how you were knitting and slipping.
Mm-hmm.
You would actually turn your work round
Mm-hmm.
and do your knitting and slipping again on needle on the second row. You wouldn't actually go in and do purl.
So any questions, give us a shout, leave a comment.
Yep.
Or go on our Facebook page or Insta page and ask a question, or even email the shop directly. Always happy to talk to customers and always happy for feedback. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
See you next time.
Bye. So here we are at the last 4 stitches. So again, you go knitwise into the knit stitch and take it off, and then you go purlwise into that knit stitch, which sits second stitch in, and bring your yarn through, and then you go in purlwise into the purl stitch and slip that off, and you go knitwise into that purl stitch, and pull the yarn through. And when you're left with the 2 last stitches, you just go knitwise into the knit stitch and take it off, and purlwise into the purl stitch and take it off, and you can pull your yarn through. So to close it up, because you've got a little bit of a gap here, you can just slide your needle under the first 2 kind of stitches, the first knit stitch here under the 2 strands, and just pull. And you will just weave in your end as normal, and you can see here we've got a nice rounded edge, and it's very stretchy. So that's how you do the Italian cast off or bind off.